The afternoon was typical for JFK Airport. The sun, muted by overcast skies, cast a soft glow over the busy terminals. Travelers hurried to catch their flights, their footsteps echoing across the polished floors. At Gate 23, passengers queued for Atlantic Sky Flight 1120, bound for Chicago. Among them was Jameer Harris, a 16-year-old boy, carefully clutching his ticket with the kind of nervous excitement that only a first solo trip can bring. His worn sneakers and a faded hoodie marked him as one of the many young people just beginning to navigate the world beyond home. The air felt heavy with the buzz of activity, but Jameer barely noticed. He was focused on the journey ahead, reuniting with family he hadn't seen in months. His mind drifted to the unknown, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As Jameer boarded the plane, he barely glanced at the other passengers seated in first class. He was just a boy, unremarkable in his attire, yet carrying with him a world of quiet hopes. It was then that he encountered Linda, the flight attendant, standing by the aisle with an air of practiced indifference. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, a flicker of disdain crossing her face, quickly hidden behind the usual airline smile. Jameer handed over his boarding pass, and as Linda looked it over, she glanced at him, then back at the ticket, as if trying to place him perhaps not by his name, but by some invisible marker. Her eyes softened, not with warmth, but with something else, something colder. "Is this your seat, sir?" she asked, her tone sharp, but neutral, almost too neutral. Jameer nodded, unsure whether to take offense or simply let the moment pass. "Yes," he replied, not offering more than what was necessary. Linda's fingers hovered over the seat assignment for a moment too long before she nodded curtly. "Very well." She handed back the ticket, her gaze fleeting. The rest of the boarding process passed uneventfully, Jameer settling into his seat with a faint sense of discomfort that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the cramped space of the plane, nor the dull hum of the engines that bothered him. It was something subtle, an undercurrent of judgment, perhaps, that seemed to follow him wherever he went, even into the confines of the airplane. Soon, the flight was airborne. The soft vibrations of the plane as it ascended were a welcome distraction. Jameer sank into his seat, feeling the rush of the air and the weightlessness that comes with flight. Yet, the unease didn't fully dissipate. As the in-flight service began, Linda moved through the cabin, her motions brisk and efficient. When she reached Jameer's row, she paused, eyeing him for a moment before offering the beverage cart. The standard options were displayed: coffee, water, juices, and a selection of alcoholic drinks for those in first class. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her voice now dipped in faint irony. "Just a Coke, please," Jameer answered quietly, hoping to avoid any more awkward exchanges. Linda raised an eyebrow, her lips pulling into something close to a smirk. "We have a fine selection of wines and cocktails, sir," she said, her words tinged with a slight edge. "I'll have a Coke," Jameer repeated, his voice steady, yet his hand tightened around the armrest. He could feel her eyes on him even as she grabbed a can of Coke from the cart. Her fingers just a little too slow as she handed it to him. The drink, however, was not handed over gently. As Linda leaned over to place the glass on his tray, the can tipped, and the dark liquid spilled first in a small stream, then entirely soaking Jameer's lap, his shirt, and splashing against his face. A few eyes flickered toward the scene, but no one said anything. Linda stood back, her face offering a practiced, though emotionless, apology. "Oh, sorry," she said, her voice flat, as if the incident were as mundane as a misplaced coffee cup. Jameer wiped his face with the napkin she handed him, feeling the cool, sticky residue of the drink on his skin. He said nothing at first, his face unreadable, trying to steady his thoughts. But there was something in the air now, a quiet tension that settled between him and Linda. Between the unspoken judgments of the world and the fragile boundaries of civility. "I believe all passengers deserve respect," Jameer said quietly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engines. His words weren't a challenge, just a statement, simple and calm, as if speaking truth to power required nothing more than a steady voice. Linda's eyes flickered, her smile, though strained, remained in place. She nodded, though her expression betrayed no remorse. "Of course, sir," she said, and moved away, her murmured comment to a fellow attendant barely reaching Jameer's ears. "Some people just don't know their place in first class." Jameer sat back, the words sinking into him. And he tried to let them pass. But they lingered, as they always did. There was nothing dramatic about what had just happened. It was, in fact, quite ordinary, but in that ordinariness, there was something profoundly unsettling. Something that ran beneath the surface. Invisible yet palpable. The quiet indignity of it all, something too small to name, yet too significant to ignore. As the flight continued, Jameer remained calm, but his mind was far from at ease. It was not just the stain on his clothes or the coldness of the drink that bothered him. It was the weight of the encounter. The moment when the world shifted slightly, ever so slightly, to remind him of who he was meant to be and who he was not. The flight attendant's actions were not the worst he had faced. But for Jameer, they were yet another reminder that in a world full of small moments, some cuts went deeper than others. And sometimes, the wounds we carry are not the ones that bleed, but the ones that never quite heal. The flight was peaceful, as it often is in the first few hours. The steady hum of the engines created a kind of rhythm, a lull that softened the noise of the world outside. Jameer sat in his seat, staring out the small oval window. The clouds were thick, but patches of blue occasionally broke through, reminding him of the sky back home. He tried to lose himself in the simplicity of the view, to forget for a moment the small but insistent unease that had followed him onto the plane. Linda moved up and down the aisles, her steps precise, almost mechanical, as she served drinks. Jameer had already noticed her stiff manner, the way she moved as if she were above the tasks of hospitality. But he hadn't paid much attention to it. He didn't expect kindness from people he didn't know. The world had taught him not to expect much. A polite smile, a courteous word, these were enough. When Linda reached his row, she stopped, her eyes briefly scanning the space around her as if assessing something. Though what exactly she was looking for, Jameer couldn't say. She paused before speaking, her words hanging in the air, just a little too heavy for something as simple as a drink order. "What would you like to drink, sir?" Her tone was neutral, but there was an edge to it, something unsaid that Jameer couldn't quite place. He looked up at her, trying to keep the conversation simple, trying to move past whatever had just passed between them. "I'll have a Coke, please," he said quietly, almost hesitant to speak, as if by saying it aloud he might make it too real. She looked at him, then at the drink cart, as though she were considering his request. There was a slight pause before she replied, her voice colder now, a little more dismissive. "We have fine wines, cocktails. Surely, you'd prefer something more than a soda?" Her words were casual, but there was a weight behind them that didn't sit right with Jameer. It wasn't the suggestion of another drink. It was the assumption, the silent judgment that ran just beneath the surface. "No," he said, his voice steady, a little firmer now. "I'll have the Coke." She sighed audibly, a small gesture, but enough to make Jameer feel it, like the air had just thickened a little. The space between them growing just a little more distant. She reached for a can of Coke, almost too deliberately, and handed it to him. As she leaned over to pour it into his cup, something changed. The motion was too quick, too careless, and the can tipped over, spilling the dark liquid across his lap, onto his shirt, drenching him in an instant. "Oh, sorry," she said, but the apology didn't feel right. It was too rehearsed, too flat. There was no warmth in it, no regret, just the faintest hint of satisfaction that he couldn't quite understand. "Looks like the glass slipped." Jameer froze. His first instinct was to jump up, to shout, to do something, but he didn't. He sat still, the cold drink soaking through his clothes, his face damp, the fabric sticking to his skin. He wiped his face with the napkin she handed him, his movements slow, deliberate. The discomfort was overwhelming, but not in the way most people would think. It wasn't the coldness of the drink or the embarrassment of the situation. It was something deeper, a quiet ache that only came when you realized that you were invisible to someone in the way that mattered most when they didn't see you, but only a reflection of what they expected you to be. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few glancing over, but none of them said a word. Jameer didn't expect them to. People like him were accustomed to being overlooked. The world was a place where silence often spoke louder than words. Where it was easier to turn away than to face what was uncomfortable. Linda stepped back, her eyes flickering to her fellow attendants. But she didn't linger. She didn't need to. The damage had been done. Jameer wiped his face again, trying to keep his expression even. He wasn't angry, not in the way most people would expect. No, his anger was something quieter. Something that had settled in him long ago. Something that came with living in a world where every small slight felt magnified. Where every subtle glance or offhand comment reminded him that some people would always see him as less than who he was. I believe all passengers deserve respect, Jameer said, his voice low, almost gentle. He wasn't shouting, wasn't making a scene. He didn't need to. His words were steady, calm, as if the truth of them were enough to fill the silence between them. Linda's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. She gave him a look, a mix of irritation and dismissal, and turned to walk away. She mumbled something under her breath, too soft for him to catch. But he didn't need to hear it. The tone, the way she carried herself, was enough. It spoke louder than words. Jameer sat there, the silence settling in, the unease still lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew that something had changed. It wasn't the spilled drink or the flight attendant's lack of courtesy. It was the quiet recognition that sometimes, what people didn't say, what they didn't do, was just as telling as what they did. He stared out the window again. But this time, the sky felt just a little further away. And though the clouds still parted in places, the blue didn't seem as bright. Not today, not after what had just happened. But Jameer didn't move. He sat still, and waited. Because sometimes, the quietest moments are the ones that speak the loudest. The flight had continued, though the atmosphere in the cabin felt somewhat different. It was a subtle change, nothing overt or loud. Just a quiet shift in the way people sat, the way they looked around the cabin. As if everyone had been made aware of something they hadn't noticed before. Perhaps it was the lingering sense of discomfort in the air. Or the unspoken realization that what had just occurred couldn't be brushed aside as easily as most things in life. A spilled drink. An awkward moment. These were not new to Jameer. He had known them all his life. In one form or another. But this time, it felt different. As the plane settled into its steady course over the clouds, Jameer glanced around the cabin. The soft murmur of conversation had returned. Though it was quieter now. More cautious. Linda had moved on, attending to other passengers with the same cold efficiency. But her actions were not forgotten. Jameer could feel it in the way the other attendants glanced in his direction from time to time. Their eyes not quite meeting his. As if afraid of catching a glimpse of something they didn't want to acknowledge. The plane's descent began as the flight continued on its path toward Chicago. Jameer's mind, however, was elsewhere. His thoughts wandered back to the incident. The way Linda's eyes had flickered when he spoke. The way her apology had sounded more like an excuse than anything genuine. It wasn't about the coke. It never really was. It was the feeling that hung around him. Like an invisible shadow that couldn't be shaken off. As the plane began to descend, Jameer reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had already decided, though it had taken him a while to get to that point. He wasn't a person who liked confrontation. But this was different. This moment, this small yet significant affront, was not going to disappear quietly into the background. He opened his camera and started recording. Not in anger, but with a quiet resolve. He captured the scene in front of him. He filmed the remnants of the spilled drink on his lap. The drips of coke still gathering at the edge of the seat. The clean white napkin smeared with the marks of what had happened. It was simple, without embellishment, a quiet, stark reflection of what had taken place. Jameer didn't know if it would make a difference. But he knew, without question, that he had to speak. Not with words, but with the lens of his camera. His hands were steady as he filmed. The action not rushed or frantic, but deliberate. He wasn't looking for sympathy. What he wanted was clarity. A moment where things were laid bare. His calm expression, the stillness of his posture, contrasted with the speed at which the world outside would begin to react to his quiet decision. The moment the plane touched down, the tension of the flight seemed to dissipate. Passengers gathered their things, some hurrying to exit, eager to get to the terminal. Jameer remained seated, his phone still in his hand. He waited, not for the rush to leave, but for the moment when he would decide what to do next. He uploaded the video quietly, carefully, knowing that once it was out there, it would be impossible to take back. It wasn't a dramatic action, but it was necessary. His finger hovered over the post button for a long moment. And when he finally pressed it, there was no turning back. The video didn't stay quiet for long. Within hours, the footage had spread across social media, shared by friends, strangers, anyone who had been touched by the quiet dignity with which Jameer had carried himself. Hashtags began to appear. Hashtag respect everyone. Hashtag stand against discrimination. Hashtag justice for Jameer. The comments started to flood in, both supportive and critical, but in the end, the video had done what it was meant to do. It had sparked a conversation. Jameer sat in his hotel room that evening, his phone buzzing with notifications. News outlets began to pick up the story. The video, simple and unembellished, had become a symbol of quiet defiance, of standing firm in the face of casual injustice. And though Jameer had never expected any of this, never imagined that his small act of recording would have such a ripple effect. It was happening. The world had taken notice. But in the midst of it all, Jameer couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence that still hung around him. It wasn't the applause or the public support that filled the air, it was the emptiness of the spaces between the words. The fact that it had taken a video for people to see what he had always known. The small, everyday injustices that went unnoticed, unchallenged, until someone pointed them out. As he scrolled through the messages and comments, Jameer felt a strange mixture of pride and weariness. The world was listening now. But at what cost? The quiet moments of prejudice. The small dismissals. The looks that said one thing while doing another. Those things were no longer just his burden to bear. But they were still there, woven into the fabric of life. And so, as the night wore on and the world around him continued to react, Jameer couldn't help but reflect on what had changed. People had seen the truth, or at least a piece of it. But truth, he knew, wasn't something that could be fully captured in a single moment. It was the quiet, everyday moments, the ones people overlooked, that told the full story. And Jameer understood now he would have to keep telling that story, even when the world moved on to the next thing. For now, though, he could only wait and watch, as the world began to ask questions that had gone unasked for far too long. The hours that followed Jameer's post were quiet. Despite the uproar that swirled around him, there was no immediate celebration, no grand recognition of what had just occurred. Instead, it was a steady stream of messages, articles, and videos, all tracing the edges of the same story. A young man, wronged in an ordinary way, demanding respect in the only way he knew how without raising his voice. Without seeking confrontation, the world was watching, but Jameer felt strangely distant from it all, as if he were merely a spectator in his own story. The news outlets picked up the video quickly, and with it, the familiar cycles of public attention began. Some people rallied around him, praising his calm and collected response to an unjust situation. Others, however, took issue with the way the moment had been captured and shared. They questioned whether Jameer's response was too much, whether the attention he had garnered was deserved. The voices in opposition were, in their own way, just as loud as those in his support. As the hours passed, Jameer's phone buzzed relentlessly, each new message a reminder of the tension that now surrounded him. He could feel the weight of it, though none of it was directed at him personally. The backlash was not about his character or his actions, but about the discomfort of acknowledging something that had always been there. Racism, in its subtle, everyday form, had always been a part of life. It didn't need to be a grand gesture of hate or violence, it was the small things. The quiet assumptions, the half-second glances, the invisible walls built between people who looked different from one another. Those things, subtle as they were, made the discomfort of watching Jameer's video all the more pronounced. The airline, Atlantic Sky, had already issued a brief statement. Linda had been suspended pending an internal review. It was a standard response. One that the company had undoubtedly given in other situations, hoping to quell the growing fire without causing too much disruption. It was, to Jameer, a predictable response. What surprised him, though, was the flood of messages condemning his actions not for what he had filmed, but for what it revealed. People were uncomfortable, and that discomfort was not about the injustice, but about the fact that it was being exposed. It wasn't about the fact that Jameer had been treated unfairly, it was the fact that someone had been bold enough to call attention to it. And now, the world was forced to examine a problem it had spent decades pretending was no longer relevant. The argument was familiar. Wasn't this just an isolated incident? Didn't people make mistakes? Wasn't Linda just having a bad day? Jameer didn't respond to any of it. He wasn't sure what he would say. His words, though thoughtful, were not needed to explain what had happened. The video said everything. There was no need for further justification. But still, the messages came. Some were supportive, others harshly critical, some simply questioned his motives, as if there needed to be a reason other than the simple truth. It was only after the airline issued a more substantial statement that the tone began to shift. The company, under increasing pressure from both the public and the media, announced it would begin an investigation into the incident and its broader policies regarding diversity and customer service. Linda's suspension was now permanent, and Atlantic Sky promised to take corrective action. But even as the words were spoken, Jameer knew this was not the end. It never was. He could feel the undercurrent of resentment growing, even among those who were on his side. The conversation had shifted from a simple act of disrespect to a broader, more uncomfortable examination of race and inequality in the everyday spaces people moved through. There was a discomfort, now a quiet reckoning with the notion that perhaps, in some corners of the world, things had not changed as much as they should have. It wasn't an easy conversation to have. It wasn't the kind of conversation that most people wanted to have. But it was the one that had to happen. Jameer sat quietly in his hotel room, looking out the window at the sprawling cityscape below. The lights of Chicago flickered in the distance. Soft and steady, life outside continued, just as it always did. But the weight of the moment sat heavily on him. A quiet pressure that had settled into his chest. This wasn't just about one flight, or one interaction. It was about something much larger. Something that stretched far beyond the confines of his experience. The airline would eventually release a more formal apology, and Linda would be dismissed from her position. But Jameer knew that this moment, while significant, was just a single point in a much larger, ongoing story. This wasn't something that could be solved with a statement or a quick fix. It wasn't something that could be wiped away with a single act of redemption. The deeper questions, the ones that went unspoken in every conversation about race, would still linger in the spaces between words. What had started as a small moment of personal indignity had now become a public spectacle. A spark that had ignited a conversation about something much larger. The responses varied, but one thing was clear: people were listening, whether they wanted to or not. And in that listening, there was both discomfort and opportunity. The world had been forced to confront something it had long ignored. But in that confrontation, Jameer felt the weight of a simple, undeniable truth. Sometimes, it takes a single, quiet moment to bring an uncomfortable truth to the surface. And once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The morning after the video went viral, the air felt different. It wasn't the rush of excitement or the anticipation of a public spectacle, it was something quieter. More settled, like the calm after a storm. The truth, though slowly and steadily, had begun to take root in places where it had been unwelcome for far too long. Jameer woke early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains of his hotel room. The phone beside him buzzed relentlessly, its screen filled with notifications, messages from friends, news outlets, and strangers, all reacting to the now famous video. Some voices were full of praise, others full of questions. The story had spread beyond the confines of social media, reaching every corner of the city, then further beyond. Yet, even in the midst of it all, Jameer felt detached, as if this was no longer his story, but one being told around him. He put the phone down, knowing it would still be there later. There was no rush to read what the world was saying. He had already seen the backlash. The subtle undermining of his actions. The words that tried to minimize the gravity of what had happened. It was just a mistake. Some had said, why bring it to the public? Others had asked. But Jameer knew that this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a reflection of something that lived beneath the surface of everyday life. Something that existed long before the incident on the plane. As the morning wore on, the first official statement from Atlantic Sky came through. It was measured, as corporate statements always are. The company had suspended Linda, their flight attendant, pending an investigation into the matter. There was no mention of racism. No acknowledgement that the incident had been anything more than an unfortunate occurrence. They were simply looking into the matter. Jameer wasn't surprised. He knew how these things worked. Corporations were careful with their words, reluctant to address uncomfortable truths directly. They preferred to hide behind vague statements, giving themselves time to weather the storm, hoping the public would move on to the next issue. And, for a moment, that's what it seemed like would happen. But the video had already done its work. The seed had been planted. And now, people were beginning to talk about what had happened. Not just on the flight, but in everyday life. It wasn't just about one flight attendant or one boy. It was about the way people in positions of power too often overlooked those who didn't look like them. The way assumptions were made before a word was even spoken. The way small acts of disregard could slowly build into something larger. In the days that followed, news outlets began to piece together the story. The more they dug into Linda's background, the more they uncovered. Linda had worked for Atlantic Sky for years. But it wasn't just her job performance that came under scrutiny, it was her behavior. Other passengers began to speak up, some revealing their own encounters with Linda's sharp, dismissive attitude. There were whispers of other incidents, ones not as blatant, but no less damaging. Jameer wasn't interested in the details of Linda's life. Her past didn't matter to him. What mattered was what had happened on that flight, the way she had treated him. The casual contempt that dripped from her words. But as the truth began to unfold, it became clear that Linda's actions were not an isolated incident. The attitudes she displayed weren't born in a vacuum. They were part of something much larger. A systemic problem that stretched far beyond one woman or one airline. The investigation, though presented as thorough, was a formality, a necessary response to the growing pressure. Linda was ultimately dismissed from her position. And the airline, in an attempt to save face, promised to implement diversity and inclusion training for its staff. But Jameer knew better than to think that such measures would bring real change. They were surface-level fixes. Things that could be seen and reported on. But they didn't address the underlying issue. Jameer had seen it all before: corporate statements, apologies, promises. But the real work, the hard work of changing minds and breaking down the barriers that kept people like him at arm's length, was never as quick or as tidy as a public apology. It wasn't something that could be solved by a statement or a training seminar. It was something that had to be lived, day in and day out. In the small moments, the ones that no one else saw. In the weeks that followed, Jameer found himself facing a new kind of pressure. The world had seen the video. And the conversation had shifted. People were paying attention now, asking questions they had avoided asking for years. Some, for the first time, were confronting the quiet discrimination they had been blind to. But even as the conversation deepened, Jameer felt an underlying tension. The truth had been brought into the light. But that didn't mean it was comfortable to face. He understood, perhaps better than most, that the real impact of what had happened wouldn't be felt in the headlines or the trending hashtags. It would be in the conversations that took place in quiet rooms. In the way people began to examine their own behaviors and attitudes. It would be in the small, everyday moments when people chose to speak out against injustice instead of ignoring it. For Jameer, the real truth was that nothing had changed. Not yet. The world might have been shaken for a moment. But the work of real change, of creating a world where people were treated with respect regardless of their skin color, where bias was acknowledged and confronted before it took root, was long and painful. It was a truth that needed to be spoken, over and over again, in the most ordinary of ways. And so, though the media had moved on, and Linda had been fired, Jameer knew the battle was just beginning. What he had done, what he had shown the world, was a moment, a small, quiet moment that had broken through years of silence. But that moment, like all moments, would eventually fade. What mattered now was what came next. And Jameer understood that the work of change would never be finished. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to continue speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made the world feel. The days that followed the viral video felt strange to Jameer. On one hand, things were moving faster than he could have ever expected. The world, it seemed, was interested in his story, had been interested for days now, and the phone calls, the emails, the messages kept coming. But on the other hand, nothing had changed, not in the way he thought it would. He had expected something different, maybe more concrete. He had imagined that once the truth was out, once the video had gone viral and the world had seen what had happened, there would be a shift, a wave of understanding, the kind of change that comes with recognition, with people finally acknowledging something that had been hidden for too long. But instead, what he found was a silence in the wake of the noise. The media buzz had quieted. Linda's name had faded from the headlines, and the airline's statements had turned to business as usual. Jameer couldn't help but feel that the world was ready to move on, to put this moment behind them, as if it were just another news cycle to be forgotten. That feeling, the fleeting nature of public attention, had always been there. Something he had seen before in others who had dared to speak out. It was never enough to make a lasting difference. The story would eventually disappear, swallowed up by the next controversy, the next trending topic. The pressure, though, never left him. It was different now. He wasn't just another nameless face. He was the boy in the video, the one who had stood up against something that so many had silently accepted. People, strangers, acquaintances, even family expected something from him now. There was a kind of weight to that expectation. A sense that he had become a symbol for something bigger than himself. Whether he liked it or not. In the quiet of his hotel room, he reflected on the messages that had come in. Some of them had been kind, full of support, encouraging him to keep going, to speak out for those who didn't have a voice. Others, though, had been less kind. They questioned his intentions, accused him of seeking attention, of blowing things out of proportion. To them, Jameer was just a kid playing a dangerous game. Someone who had brought unnecessary conflict into an otherwise peaceful world. He tried not to let the harsh words get to him. But they did, not because of the content, but because of the way they echoed the quiet prejudices that existed beneath the surface of everyday life. It wasn't the obvious hate that bothered him, the kind that could be confronted and called out. It was the subtle dismissals, the things people didn't say but made clear through their actions. It was the way people would look at him, not for who he was, but for who they thought he was supposed to be. To them, the world wasn't divided into categories of right and wrong, it was divided into categories of convenience. People were judged by what they looked like, by what they wore, by where they came from. And in that judgment, Jameer was still seen as less than. The conversations he had been part of now, the ones he was being asked to lead, were often full of well-meaning people who genuinely wanted to understand. But who also didn't really understand. They wanted to talk about respect, about how things needed to change. But the language of those conversations never really touched on the heart of the issue. They spoke in terms of solutions, in terms of what could be done in the future. What they didn't acknowledge was that these were not new problems. They had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface, only now visible because of one simple act of defiance. The truth was, Jameer didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like he had done something revolutionary. He had simply done what anyone should have done in that situation, spoken up when he was wronged. But the world had turned that into something else entirely. And now, the weight of it all felt heavy. A burden that was never his to bear, but one he found himself holding nonetheless. In conversations with his family, there was a quiet sense of pride. Yes, but also concern. They were proud of him, for standing up for himself, for demanding respect in a world that so often denied it. But they were also worried, afraid of the consequences that came with being noticed. The world was not always kind to those who pointed out uncomfortable truths. They had seen it happen before, people who had spoken up, only to be dismissed or erased by those in power. Jameer could feel that concern in the way his mother looked at him. In the way his cousin kept checking in, asking if he was okay, reminding him to be careful. It wasn't just about the incident anymore. It was about what came after, the way that small moment had somehow turned into a magnifying glass, amplifying everything around him. Every word he said now seemed to carry more weight. Every action scrutinized more closely. He was no longer just Jameer, the 16-year-old boy traveling to see family. He was Jameer, the boy who had stood up to racism in a public way. And with that new identity came a host of expectations he hadn't asked for. The reality was that Jameer wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with all of this. He wasn't sure if the world had actually changed, or if it was just pretending to. He wasn't sure if his actions had made a lasting impact, or if they were just a brief moment in time that would eventually fade, like everything else. But what he did know, what he had always known, was that this wasn't over. Not for him, and not for anyone. The world hadn't changed with one act of defiance, it hadn't changed with a video. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was a start. And for Jameer, that was enough. He couldn't change the world in one moment. But maybe, just maybe, he could start a conversation that would last longer than the headlines. And that, in itself, was something worth fighting for. The days moved quietly after Jameer's public confrontation, like the soft rhythm of a tide that ebbs and flows without the sudden crashes of a storm. There were moments when he felt the weight of everything, the responsibility that had been quietly placed upon his shoulders. But those moments were always brief, fleeting like the echoes of a far-off sound. And in their place was a calm, a stillness that allowed him to reflect on everything that had happened. The public response had settled. The news had moved on, as it always did, shifting to new stories, new faces, and new controversies. But for Jameer, the attention had begun to fade into something more manageable. The phone calls and messages had slowed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. However, there was a quiet change in the air, one that Jameer couldn't quite name but could feel in the spaces around him. At first, Jameer thought it would be enough to let the situation be just a moment in time, something that had stirred up the world for a brief period, but then disappeared back into the everyday. But as the weeks passed, something else began to emerge. Conversations started to happen, slow and deliberate, in places Jameer had never expected. He overheard them in passing, during conversations with strangers, in the waiting areas of airports, in cafes where people sat together, unaware of his presence. It was in those conversations that Jameer began to see the impact of his actions, not in the headlines, not in the applause, but in the way people had started to talk about what had happened. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. People were talking about race, about prejudice, about the small, insidious ways that judgment crept into everyday interactions. They were confronting the uncomfortable reality that racism existed not just in moments of overt hatred, but in the quiet, everyday exchanges that people so often dismissed. Jameer had always known this. Of course, he had grown up in a world where his skin color was a mark that others sometimes saw before they saw him. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing it acknowledged in ways that it never had been before, felt different. It felt like the air itself had shifted. Just slightly, just enough to make things feel less settled, less comfortable. Atlantic Sky, in the aftermath of the incident, began to implement changes. They made promises about diversity and inclusion, about sensitivity training for their staff. Jameer wasn't sure if it would make any real difference. He had seen companies make such promises before, with little to show for it. But he didn't focus too much on that. What mattered was the conversation, the way people were beginning to examine the things that were normally ignored. It wasn't about the airline's response anymore. It was about what happened when people stopped pretending that things were fine. In the weeks that followed, Jameer found himself invited to speak at various events. At first, it felt strange, this idea of being a voice for something much larger than himself. He was just a boy, he thought, a boy who had stood up to an injustice in the simplest way he knew how. But the more he spoke, the more he realized that his story, though just one piece of a much larger narrative, was part of the process of healing. It wasn't about him being the center of attention. It was about giving a voice to something that had been silenced for too long. He spoke quietly, without embellishment, without trying to make the moment bigger than it was. He simply told the truth. And the truth was that nothing had changed overnight. But change, he knew, was never immediate. It was in the slow, steady shift of attitudes, in the conversations that happened when no one was paying attention. It was in the way people, now, took a moment to pause, to think about the things they might have missed before. The real change, the one that mattered, wasn't the kind that came from a single act of defiance or a viral video. It was the kind that came from the quiet, unremarkable moments of everyday life. Jameer began to see his role not as someone who had sparked an uprising, but as someone who had started a conversation. He had provided a small moment of clarity, a brief glimpse of something that had always been there, and in doing so, he had opened the door for others to begin talking about it too. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't dramatic, but it was something. As he sat in a small room one evening, preparing for yet another speaking engagement, Jameer reflected on the journey he had taken. He wasn't the same person who had boarded that flight months ago. He had learned something about the world, about people, and about himself. He had learned that change often came slowly, that it didn't require grand gestures or loud speeches, but rather, quiet persistence. It came in the moments when people chose to listen, when they chose to reflect on their own biases and ask themselves why things were the way they were. And in that, Jameer found a kind of peace. He had done what he could. He had started something. Whether or not it would grow into something bigger, something lasting, was beyond him. But that wasn't the point. The point was that, for once, people were listening, and that was a start. As the evening wore on and the small gathering began to form, Jameer looked around the room. He knew that change didn't happen in a single moment, in a single speech, in a single act of defiance. It happened in the slow, steady accumulation of truth, in the quiet conversations that would ripple out and touch lives he would never know. He didn't need to be the center of it. He just needed to keep speaking, to keep telling the truth. And in doing so, he hoped that others would start to do the same. Because real change, he knew, would never come from just one voice. It would come from all of them, speaking together. Time, as it always does, moved on. The world had shifted, if only just slightly. The noise had quieted, but the echoes of that moment of Jameer's video, of Linda's dismissal, of the public conversations that followed lingered in the background. Like a quiet hum, people went back to their lives, to their routines, and yet something had changed. If only in small, subtle ways. Jameer, now accustomed to the attention, no longer felt the weight of it pressing on him as it once had. The sharpness of the world's gaze had dulled into something softer, something more manageable. He had spoken, and the world had listened. But now, what mattered was not the response, but the quiet conversations that continued without him. In the months that followed, he spoke at events, joined discussions, and shared his story with people who were willing to listen. But it wasn't the applause that sustained him. It was the moments when people came up to him, quietly, privately, with words of thanks, of recognition, or of shared experience. There were those who admitted they had never noticed the small ways in which they had overlooked others. Those who confessed to their own biases, their own assumptions. These were the moments Jameer cherished, not the applause of strangers, but the quiet understanding of those who had begun to see things differently. In the beginning, he had expected everything to change overnight. He had thought that after speaking out, things would be different, that the world would suddenly see what he saw. But now, he understood that real change was never immediate. It was not something that could be captured in a viral video or a single act of courage. It was the slow, quiet work of awareness, of confronting the things people didn't want to see and didn't want to talk about. And that work would take time. One afternoon, Jameer sat in a small cafe, reflecting on everything that had happened. He watched people around him, unaware of the quiet shifts taking place, of the ways in which their perceptions were changing. People were still going about their lives, still caught up in the routines that made the world feel safe and predictable. But Jameer knew something had shifted beneath the surface. something that couldn't be unseen. For him, that was enough. Change, he realized, wasn't about big moments or grand gestures. It was about consistency, about the quiet resolve to keep going. Even when the world seemed intent on ignoring the problem. He thought of the many conversations he had had. The ones that seemed small in the moment but were actually the ones that mattered most. People had started to reflect on their own biases, to question their own assumptions, and to ask why they treated others the way they did. It was, Jameer thought, a quiet revolution, one that had started with something as simple as a spilled drink. But it wasn't over, not yet. Jameer had learned that change came not from loud declarations, but from small, consistent actions. He had spoken out once. But that wasn't enough. It would take more moments, more conversations, more opportunities to challenge the assumptions that people carried with them every day. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't want to be. He was simply someone who had pointed out a truth that had always been there. And in doing so, had invited others to see it too. The ripple effect of what he had done was still unfolding. It was in the subtle shifts in attitude he saw in the people around him. It was in the small victories, the moments when someone caught themselves before making a dismissive comment. The times when a person took the extra step to be kind. To see someone for who they were, not for what they assumed them to be. Jameer sat back in his chair and looked out the window, watching the world move on outside. It was easy to believe that nothing had changed, that the problems of race and prejudice were too entrenched to ever truly be solved. But he knew better. He knew that change wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, the slow, steady work of questioning, of challenging, of asking difficult questions and listening for the answers. For Jameer, the impact of what had happened wasn't about him. Not really. It was about everyone else, the people who had been forced to confront their own biases. The ones who had been given the chance to change. And that, he realized, was a lasting change. As he prepared to leave the cafe, Jameer thought about the quiet work that lay ahead. There would be more conversations. More moments when he would be asked to share his story. To explain what had happened. To remind people that there was still work to be done. But he was ready for it. Because, in the end, he knew that the real impact of what he had done wouldn't be in the big headlines or the viral videos. It would be in the quiet, everyday actions of people who had learned to see each other a little more clearly. To treat each other with just a bit more respect. And that, Jameer thought, was a start.